Reading Chapter 9 in Dreams, Evolution, and Value Fulfillment by Jane Roberts, a Seth book. Volume 2. Chapter 9 is titled Master Events and Reality Overlays. So before I start, I just want to mention here, and then at the end of the video, I'll actually read what Jane received prior to this session on Master Events. But right here it says that yesterday she'd, meaning Jane received many insights from Seth on Master Overlays, and she made notes. She typed some of her information after supper, and I'm presenting this in Note 1. Just to show how closely at times the body of the Seth material lies to her ordinary consciousness. So, I'll read that after this session, so you can see kind of like what Jane's receiving. It's just little bits and pieces, but anyways, okay, so Seth says, Chapter 9. Master events are those whose main activity takes place in inner dimensions. Such events are too, T-O-O, such events are too multidimensional to appear clearly in your reality, so that you see or experience only parts of them. They are source events. Their main thrust is in what you can call the vaster dimensions of dreams, the unknown territory of inner reality. The terms you use make no difference. The original action, however, of such events is unmanifest, not physical. Those events then, quote, subsequently show themselves in time and space, with extraordinary results. They shed light upon the, quote, facts of historical time and influence those events. Master events may end up translated through mythology or religion or art, or the effects may actually serve to give a framework to an entire civilization, as indeed occurred in the case of Christianity, as I will explain later. Now, the origin of the universe that you know, as I have described it, was of course a master event. The initial action did not occur in space or time, but formed space and time. In your terms, other universes with all their own space and time structures were created simultaneously and exist simultaneously. The effect of looking outward into space, and therefore backward into time, is a kind of built-in convention that appears within your own space-time picture. You must remember then, when you think in terms of origins, that the very word, quote, origin, is dependent upon time conventions and a belief in beginnings and endings. Beginnings and endings are themselves effects that seem to be facts to your perceptions. In a fashion, they simply represent beginnings and endings, the boundaries, the reaches, and the limitations of your own span of attention. I said that in your terms, all universes were created simultaneously at the same time. The very sentence structure has time built in, you see, so you are bound to think that I'm speaking of an almost indescribable past. Also, I use time terms since you are so used yourselves to that kind of categorizing. So here we will certainly run into our first seeming contradiction. When I say that in the higher order of events, all universes, including your own, have their original creations occurring now, with all of their pasts and futures built in, and with all of their scales of time winding ever outward and all of their appearances of space, galaxies and nebula, and all of their seeming changes being instantly and originally created in what you think of as this moment. Your universe cannot be its own source. Its inner mysteries, which are indeed the mysteries of consciousness, not matter, cannot be explained and must remain incomprehensible if you try to study them from the viewpoint of your objective experience alone. You must look to the source of that experience. You must look not to space, but to the source of space, not to time, but to the source of time. And most of all, you must look to the kind of consciousness that experiences space and time. You must look, therefore, to events that show themselves through historical action, but whose origins are elsewhere. None of this is really beyond your capabilities as long as you try to enlarge your framework. The entire idea of evolution, of course, requires strict adherence to the concept of continuing time and the changes that time brings. And such concepts can, at best, provide the most surface kind of explanation for the existence of your species or any other. I hope, again, to stretch the reaches of both your imaginations and intellects in this book, to give you a feeling for events larger than your usual true or false, fact or fancy categories. Your existence as a species is characterized far more by your unique use of your imagination than by any physical attributes. Your connections with that unmanifest universe have always helped direct your imaginations, made you aware of the rich veins of probabilities possible in physical existence, so that you could then use your intellects to decide which of the alternate routes you wanted as a species to follow. In that regard, it is true that in other species, innate knowledge is more clearly, brilliantly, and directly translated into action. I am not speaking of some dumb instinct, but instead of an intuitive knowing, a high intelligence different from your own, but amazingly complex, with which other species are equipped. Man, however, deals with probabilities with the creativity in a unique fashion, a fashion that is made possible because of the far more dependable behavior of the other species. In a fashion, man also is equipped with the ability to innate actions on a non-physical level that then become physical and continue to wind in and out of both realities, entwining dream events with historic ones, in such a fashion that the original non-physical origins are often forgotten. Man overlays the true reality quite spontaneously. He often reacts to dream events as if they were physical, and to physical events as if they were dreams. This applies individually and collectively, but man is often unaware of that interplay. In the terms of evolution, as you think of it, ideas are more important than genes, for we are again dealing with more than the surfaces of events. We are dealing with more than some physical mechanics of being. For one thing, the genes themselves are conscious, though in different terms than yours. Your cultures, your civilizations, obviously affect the well-being of your species, and those cultures are formed by your ideas and forged through the use of your imaginations and your intellects. Certain bloodlines, in your terms, were extinguished because of your beliefs in Christianity, as people were killed in your holy wars. Your beliefs have directed who should go to war and who should not, who should live and who should die, who should be educated and who should not, who should be isolated from society and who should not. All matters directly touching upon the survival of certain families throughout history, and therefore affecting the species as a whole. I am not here specifically blaming Christianity, for far before its emergence, your ideas and beliefs about good and evil were far more important in all matters regarding the species than any simple questions of genetic variances, natural selection, or environmental influence. In man's case, at least, the selection of who should live or die was often anything but natural. If you are to understand the characteristics of the species, then you cannot avoid the study of man's consciousness. Okay, so that's the end of this session, but right here in the notes it says, Jane says, he didn't go into all the stuff I got yesterday, but then he went into other stuff I didn't get. I feel like he was about to lead the reader over some important material. That's a quote from Jane after the session that Rob noted down. So these are Jane's notes I was talking about that I would read at the end. Jane wrote about her activities yesterday. And this is all Jane. Quote, Sunday, June 8th, 1980. As I went about the day, showering, doing my hair, reading the paper, doing my exercises, and so forth, I kept getting stuff from Seth on the next chapter of his book. I think to be called Master Events and Overlays. There can be overlays of one civilization onto another, so that a real civilization in one sphere of existence can appear as myth in another. Our civilization appears as myth in other worlds. That kind of thing represents only one kind of overlay. I got unclear glimpses of material on Atlantis that I didn't really get well enough to note down, and about Christianity, as both representing certain certain kinds of overlays, and as examples of master events. I got a definition of master events but forgot some of it, to the effect that master events are spectacular events whose main thrusts are outside of time, but whose actions on or in time are extravagant, out of proportion to their actual historical connections. The physical part of such an event in history is actually minimal in contrast to its effects, and something about master events touching the worlds of imagination and reason in different ways. And that though Seth spoke about some matters being almost impossible to explain, he enjoyed the challenge and felt a sense of achievement rather than frustration. End quote. In ordinary terms, that challenge, that achievement, are Jane's own, as she seeks to bring to consciousness information from the creative Seth portion, whatever its source may be, of her psyche, and unite it with her, quote, usual creative achievements. An exhilarating quest indeed, even given the limitations imposed by words with, quote, some matters being almost impossible to explain, end quote. Jane and Rob are talking about Rob's notes, and Jane says, Rob records, quote, this is Jane, master events are actually other wrinkles in probabilities, end quote. Jane adds, quote, they explain why Christianity has had such far-reaching effects for almost 2,000 years, when its original experiences were so small in time and space, why we attach so much significance to those desert countries over there even now." End quote. Okay, so I'm not going into this next session, but I do want to read this next session, 920, now at the end of this video, so that you don't have to hear it at the beginning of the next. And I'm not going to read it all. A lot of it is not stuff that's necessary to read, but I'm going to read to you some of the stuff. So just, if you want to hear it, keep listening. So keep in mind that this particular session is in October 1980, and Rob is noting here a few things about Jane's difficulties at the time. He writes, "During those times, I was extremely sorry to note that Jane's physical symptoms, her difficulties, walking and performing other routine tasks, were obviously becoming much worse. By then, my wife was almost always uncomfortable to some degree and sometimes in outright pain. She had to sit on a high stool to do the dishes. She still walked by leaning on her typing table and pushing it forward step by step. But she did this much less frequently, perhaps only once or twice a day. Instead, it became routine for her to get around the house by using her feet to draw herself along as she sat in her wheeled office chair. She seldom left the house. She could barely maneuver down the 2 steps into the garage off her writing room and into our car. Jane had a lot of trouble getting into the shower. She had much difficulty sitting for the long hours she spent at her desk. Her fingers didn't work easily when she typed, or wrote with a pen and pencil, or held a paintbrush. Jane resisted lying down a couple of times a day to get some relief, although usually I was able to talk her into doing so. For many complex reasons, she refused to go the conventional medical route, as she always had, and I felt, and still do, that my own hang-ups in that area prevented me from helping her as much as I should have. Instead, Jane insisted upon trying to use her abilities to help herself. I grieved to see my wife in such distress, but ultimately could do little beyond helping her get as comfortable as possible. Among other things, I bought her a water-filled cushion for her chair. It gave her some relief, but she needed much more help than that. The worsening condition was between June and July, and this particular session that I just read was October. So anyways, Rob continues, "Jane's worsening situation through June and July then prepared her to accept my suggestion that Seth could help her. She put aside the first session for Chapter 9 of Dreams and began Seth's sessions on the magical approach to reality. As Seth remarked on August 6th, when he gave his first session on the subject, quote, when Rupert finished his project, God of Jane, he found himself with all of that time that was supposed to be used. This is the way that she thinks. He also became aware of his limitations, physically speaking. There was not much, it seemed, he could do but work. So he took the rational approach, and it says that to solve the problem, you worry about it." End quote. So Rob adds, "I was delighted when Jane began to show physical improvements almost at once during those early August days, and so was she. It's not contradictory to note that during August and September, following his regular schedule of twice-weekly sessions, Seth methodically presented some very exciting concepts. So closely do those 13 sessions fit together that it's most difficult to give excerpts. Seth's magical approach material represents one of his best efforts to help us, as well as others. Jane's difficulties certainly inspired them, but their creativity also goes beyond our own needs. And as soon as I realized she was going to continue the series for a while, I jokingly asked her what was going on. Quote, "What do you think you're up to, hon? Are you doing a book within a book or what?" End quote. Quote from Rob. He adds, "My wife didn't answer yes or no, but I could see that she was pleased and that she was thinking about it. The title of the new book would be Automatic: The Magical Approach to Reality, a Seth book." Highly recommend reading that book, especially right now while you're listening to this book. If nothing else, go buy The Magical Approach. Read that when you're not listening to this book. Seriously, they go together. It's amazing. Anyways, she's also going back to her If We Live Again, or Public Magic and Private Love. It's her book of poetry, which also helps her mentally to be enthusiastic, and which helps her condition. But there's also limiting beliefs that she still holds, and it goes into that later into the book. Okay, so what I'm about to read is pertinent to the next part that I'm going to do, which is the next session 920. Hopefully you guys are following along and able to just like go one to the next, and you'll totally make sense. But anyways, I'm going to give it now so I don't have to give it at the beginning or the end of the next video. It says, "At the beginning of the notes for this 920th session, I wrote that the session isn't dictation for dreams. Yet it is, of course," this is Rob, "since in it Seth illuminates from still another perspective his concept of value fulfillment. The session grew out of an encounter we had yesterday afternoon with an unexpected visitor from out of state. Seth hardly mentions the individual involved, however, but instead goes into the subject of mental illness in more inclusive terms. I see many correlations between this evening's material and that in session 917 for chapter 8. There, among other things, Seth has discussed the reasoning mind, the imaginative mind, and schizophrenia. That session had been triggered, at least in part, by a letter Jane had found to be quite upsetting. I admit that for some mysterious reason of my own, I let Bill Baker, as I'll call that youngish individual, fool me when he knocked on our back porch door yesterday afternoon. He was very well dressed and very well spoken, and I didn't pay enough attention to the doubts I sensed when he told me about hearing voices in his head, and asked if Jane did the same thing with Seth. I said no. After introducing him to my wife, I went back to my writing room. I could understand what they were saying by concentrating upon the murmur of their voices from the living room, but I seldom did so. She almost called me, Jane said later, when she realized that Bill Baker is a disturbed person. He told her he'd been hospitalized several times for mental problems and demonstrated his ability to speak very fluently a, quote, nonsense language he cannot decipher. Later, I remember hearing a bit of that. Our caller had received a number of pages of information from Jesus Christ. He described how he's relating the Seth material to his sexual fantasies involving young girls, and detailed other instances in which he'd been strongly rebuffed when trying to physically actualize some of Seth's ideas. There was more. Jane caught him in a number of contradictory statements. Bill Baker left soon after learning that Jane no longer holds her ESP classes. The episode reminded us once again that many of our visitors are seeking help of one kind or another, and that we hadn't had the remotest idea that this would be the case when Jane began her psychic development late in 1963. Sometimes we're not sure whether the people are simply rebelling against the help offered by establishment disciplines, especially when that, quote, help is partially or wholly ineffective, or are more aware than most that some individuals like Jane have other, quote, psychic dimensions of personality that can be asked for information. Yeah, I told Jane, look at the excellent letters we've received recently from psychiatrists, mathematicians, and, quote, ordinary folk engaged in a variety of endeavors. And Bill Baker has benefited from reading the Seth material, I said, since now he reasons that some of his ideas are, quote, core beliefs that he's created and so can change. Quote, where would I be without the Seth material? End quote, he'd asked Jane. Okay, so this next session that is going to be read in the next video is going to be on schizophrenia. So that experience, that event that happened in their lives was no coincidence. Seth uses that as a point around which to build a discussion. And so yeah, this next video will be on schizophrenia. It is interesting, and even if you're not like interested in the whole schizophrenia thing, I still recommend you listening to it.